Welcome to the first episode of the Popperian Podcast. This will be a monthly podcast where we look at the life and the work of Karl Popper. As always, I'm going to be your host, Jed Lea-Henry, but on today's program we have Professor of Physics at Center of Quantum Computation at Clarendon Laboratory, as well as an Honorary Fellow at Wolfson College. He's also the author of two books that I have on my shelf here that I read more times than I care to admit, and this is The Fabric of Reality and the Beginning of Infinity. This is David Deutsch. David, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, good evening.
So for many people that have read your work or listened to your lectures, they will know that Popper has been influential to you of your life. But I might wind things back to your first chance meeting with the work of Popper. This is a story I've heard you say before. It's when you were back in your university days. You're a student. I believe you're at Cambridge. And It was almost a chance encounter with Popper. So take us back there.
Yes, it was pure chance. I had literally just heard of Popper once before, out of context. I'd heard that he'd written a book called Conjectures and Refutations. And I thought, oh, that seems quite interesting. I thought it was a book of conjectures and refutations. But I hadn't read it, and I hadn't read any Popper, and I only remembered the name because it's an odd name. And I got to hear of him. This is the story you've probably heard. I was an undergraduate. I wanted to do research in physics, and I was very curious about finding out about the known and unknown things about physics, but I realized that I'd never really thought about what knowledge in physics is. And so I went to the bookshop and got a book by Bertrand Russell. I've actually forgotten which one it was, but it had a lot about induction in it. And so I wrote an essay about induction and how I hoped to make use of it in my future career. And I was quite pleased with the essay. So we were supposed to meet once a term with what they call in Cambridge a tutor. It's what's called in Oxford a moral tutor. Tutor doesn't give you tutorials. A tutor is kind of in charge of your moral welfare, and like if you get into trouble or something, then he's the one that you go to in the college, and he helps you out and whatever. And my tutor was a historian called Charles Parkin. And I never knew what to say to him on these termly visits, because it was all like, how are you doing? Have you had any problems? And that wasn't, I wasn't like that kind of client for him. So I never knew what to say, and it was always slightly awkward. So I thought I'd send him, before I went to see him, I thought I'd send him this essay. And he said, very interesting, but, you go on about induction here. Isn't that a bit old hat? Hasn't that been, like, refuted by this Popper chappie? And that was very rare in those days for anyone to have heard of Popper, especially someone in the humanities. And I said basically no. I didn't know he had anything to do with induction, and I've only once heard of him. And he said, "Well, yeah, I think that's what they say nowadays," which also wasn't true. Most philosophers of science thought that Popper was ridiculous, and everybody else hadn't heard of him. His books were quite hard to get, and so I went straight to the bookshop after this recommendation. I think it was Heffer's in Cambridge, and the only book by Popper I could find was The Open Society and Its Enemies, volumes 1 and 2. So volume 1 was about Plato, volume 2 was Hegel and Marx, and I didn't see how this could be of any interest but I thought Hegel and Marx would be nearer to the present day at least. So I bought that one, and I found that it was a completely new way of looking at philosophy, and I was just bowled over by the sheer seriousness of the way Popper dealt with ideas. I'd been quite impressed with Bertrand Russell, but Popper just outclassed him in this feature. Both of them were quite clear in their writing, which I later found is very, very unusual in philosophers. Both of them. So that's how I got into Popper, and having read that, I then bought Volume 1 and read that as well. And that kind of told me what Volume 2 was really all about. And then I slowly found whenever I passed a bookshop, I would go in and see if there are any Popper books in there. There was no Amazon in those days either. So, yes, I slowly got to read it. But it took me about 4 years to actually really get anything. Like, I thought Popper was all about falsificationism, and I didn't really get the connection between his political philosophy and his philosophy of science. And I didn't really get the philosophy of science either. But I saw that there was something there that was really, really important. And so I carried on thinking about it, and that's how I became a Popperian.
Well, let's build up towards that thing that is so important. And I'm going to probably come back to your answer there a little bit later on, and there's a lot of things that ping my mind that I'm going to bring up later on. But let's go back to one of the centralities of Popper here, and this, of course, is the question of knowledge, or how we know. And you have this wonderful history, I believe it's in The Beginning of Infinity, where you explain this deep course of human history, and you describe it as a history, I believe, of complete failure. But you describe the people alive at the time, and I think this has missed a lot of people that have read your book or listened to your lectures by. You describe them as people that all wanted to know. So what did you mean by that?
Yes, I think our species is distinguished from other species by this capacity to know in the human sense, that is, to create explanations of the world, and I think this actually predates our species, but all the other species that had this ability went extinct. They're all related to our species, Neanderthals and those species. We're the only survivors. And that's already a bit of a mystery, because if you have this ability, then you're constantly trying to explain the world. It was beneficial. We know that it evolved relatively fast as these things go. And therefore it must have been beneficial to the genes that the people with these genes tended to reproduce more, survive more, so as to propagate those genes. And therefore it must have been beneficial. And yet, if we look at the paleontology and archaeology and so on of those times, we find that for thousands of years at a time, the rhythm, the content of human life was unchanging. So for an individual would live and die using the same methods of getting food, of making tools, of organizing society or families and so on, and making campfires or whatever. They were all the same at the time of their death as at the time of their birth, And in fact, they were the same for hundreds of generations at a time. So what was going on? What was going on at that time for this unique ability, which had been so useful when it evolved, not to do anything useful anymore? Why didn't it? And well, now we're used to creativity operating on a timescale of a year or two. You can already tell that the things are old-fashioned after a couple of years. In those days, they weren't old-fashioned over a period of 10,000 years. So why? And some people say, well, they already had a pleasant way of life, a way of life that suited them. They didn't apply creativity to trying to make better campfires or better stone tools. They used it for something of which there is no trace. Perhaps they used it for song or dance or having deeper relationships with their families and so on. But that's obviously untenable, because we know that they had very short lifespans, that they died of things that are very painful and unpleasant, and for which the cures were very, very simple by our standards. For example, better shoes, cooking their food, and yet they didn't improve. They didn't improve these things over tens of thousands of years. So they wanted better, but they didn't get it. That's what I mean.
So let's step that forward then, another step here. What were these original sources of knowledge for, so we wind back the clock to times, I suppose, before the Enlightenment? What were the sources of knowledge? Is it only coming from authority at that time?
Yes, well, it came from tradition, which is still the case today. All our knowledge is based on tradition, but we change it faster, we improve it faster. In those days, it also came from tradition, but the tradition included traditions of stasis. That is, the ways of dealing with ideas were fine-tuned to keep the ideas unchanged. And the paradigmatic example of this is religions, which actually say explicitly that if you change it, then you will suffer eternally or whatever. But that's actually rather unusual. It's rather unusual for traditions and ideas to explicitly say that they want to remain in place. It's more usual for them just to be evolved to have that property. So yes, source of knowledge was tradition, and that was also a source of a great deal of error. That is the human condition. that our ideas are always full of errors. But nowadays, it's much less the case that they are entrenched errors. There still are many entrenched errors today, but our entire society and way of life is no longer built upon them.
So I can see us building this forward to the problem situation that Popper found himself in. So you mentioned the Enlightenment and this important moment where authorities are rejected. But you also go on to say that rejecting authorities is not quite as important as it always was. And of course, one of the things, one of the implements which people brought about to reject authority at this time was what you mentioned earlier, empiricism. So what was the change there, and what was empiricism?
Yes, as I said, the authorities had been challenged many times. In fact, it's quite common for authority to be challenged and overturned. But what had historically been the case is that authorities had been overturned and replaced by new authorities of the same kind. And so there's this poem by Yeats of the beggars had changed places, but the lash goes on. That was the usual way. What happened in the Enlightenment was a new thing that may have also happened many times before, less often, but on all previous occasions it had been snuffed out within a generation or two. And that was challenging authority for the purpose not of setting up a new authority, but for the purpose of creating new knowledge. That is, the idea was that what we were rebelling to do was to have an open-ended increase in knowledge. So you began to get the idea that in the whole of the Enlightenment was pervaded by the idea that humans are fallible, but that we can improve, and that the important thing is to set up conditions under which progress, improvement, is possible, which contradicted almost all previous traditions. The very idea of a tradition is something that stays the same. But with the Enlightenment came this new kind of tradition, which Popper called tradition of criticism, which he traces back to the pre-Socratic philosophers in ancient Greece. But it never took hold as a fundamental feature of society before, or at least not as a lasting feature of society, until the European Enlightenment of the 18th century.
So from that, of course, we're walking through philosophers from Bacon and forward to Hume. And of course, one of the solutions that philosophers came up through the years for the problem of empiricism was induction, an idea, in short, that that the unseen in some ways resembles the seen. And of course, Popper has a deep challenge to this. So why is it that the unseen doesn't resemble the seen? Because I know I've encountered many people myself. It seems to feel instinctively true for many people, even many scientists in the field that have been there for many years. They seem to have this instinctive feel that you can somehow gather knowledge simply by observing the world.
Yes, it's surprisingly tenacious, this idea, since it is in fact refuted all the time by all our experiences. So it's simply not true that the future resembles the past. What I guess, and by the way, I should say, in your quick history of philosophy, you left out the fact that empiricism, when it was invented, was an enormous improvement on what went before. Because even though it's said that knowledge comes from the senses, which is not true, that it comes from observation, which is not true, that we can gain authority by observation and so on, which is also not true. None of those things are true. But it was contradicting the previous alleged sources of knowledge and authority, namely political authority from kings and so on, and the authority of ancient writings in philosophy and science and so on, and the authority, of course, of religion in morality and so on. It was challenging all those, and that was initially an enormous benefit, but it simply wasn't true from beginning to end that we gain knowledge in that way. And this had, and with empiricism, as you said, came induction, the more specific idea that we get it from looking at repeated things in the past, and we see that repeated things in the past tend to be repeated in the future. Now, careful philosophers, notably David Hume, but it goes right back to antiquity. Notice that there is no such process, that no such form of justification, that no sequence of propositions can possibly tell you anything about the next proposition. If you have some sequence of propositions that you know nothing about the next one, then you cannot deduce anything about the next one from the previous ones. It's simply a simple logical fact. And that pulls the rug out from under empiricism. And people had known that, therefore, that empiricism, that induction is invalid, but they thought that perhaps we still do it even though it is invalid. And there's something, that something beneficial about the universe that just makes it so that inductions turn out to be true quite often. And it isn't the case. The vast majority of things that you see when you open your eyes in the morning to when you fall asleep at night, you have never seen before. There is something about them that you have seen before, like when you look out of the window in the morning and you see the sun and the clouds and so on. You have seen the sun and clouds before. If you were to take an image of those and look at the pixels, there would be many pixels that weren't the same as yesterday's pixels. And it would never be the case that most of the pixels are the same as what they were yesterday. You might not even look out of the window. You might not look out in the same way, and so on. So the reason why we subjectively tend to think that we're seeing the same things is that we have a theory about what it is in the scene that is important, what it is that will have regularities that we can rely on. And that is because we have theories to that effect. And so this leads to the Popper's maxim that the theory comes first. Induction may seem to be true because we make the observations in the light of theories. Hang on. My mobile phone thinks that when I say theory, I'm saying Siri. I cannot get it to rid itself of that preconception. And so it probably thinks that it's heard the word Siri many, many times.
Yes.
And has thought it was theory it's heard the word theory, thought it meant Siri many, many times. And so this is an additional case, and will make it even more sure of that in the future. Yes. I'm of course paraphrasing an anecdote of Popper's, where he was chatting to the was it Adler, the psychoanalyst, one of the psychoanalysts, I think it was Adler, where Adler had just interpreted something according to his theory, and Popper said, "How do you know?" And he said, "In the light of my thousandfold experience." And so Popper replied, "And I suppose with this case, your experience has become 1,001-fold." At which point, supposedly, Adler was very angry. But this just all goes to show that induction just isn't true. It's not just that induction is invalid, which is logically invalid, which is something that had been known since antiquity, but that Popper added to this that induction just doesn't happen. It's not that we do it, but it's invalid, but it somehow works. We don't do it. What we do is we have a theory first, and in the case where we're creating new knowledge, this theory is a conjecture, which is not based on anything. It's a hoped for solution to some problem. So in Popper's scheme of things, instead of starting with observation and inducing general theories, we start with a problem. Then we guess a solution, then we test it, and that's the place where observation comes in, like at step 3, not at step 1.
Well, I might actually dig into that question a little bit there, because, of course, we've just walked into the great problem that Popper found himself within. In fact, I believe it's Objective Knowledge, the book. He starts it off with this, I'm going to paraphrase slightly here. He starts off the book with something like, I believe I solved the problem of induction many years ago, but no one paid any attention to it. Yes. And this is, he goes on, and he does sound a little aggrieved that he's not being listened to. And it's hard to blame him if he's repeating himself so often here, I imagine. But you said something really important there. It's really an interesting way to look at the world, of course, this idea that the world, I think it's Popper's quote, the world is theory laden. But you said it starts with a problem. And Popper had a quote, I believe it says, if you want to understand someone's philosophy or theory, you need to understand their problem situation. So why is it that knowledge starts from a problem?
Yes, by the way, it's observation that's theory-laden. You said the world is theory-laden. Yeah, well, the reason it starts with the problem is this is the only possible way that that knowledge could grow, since there is no justified or reliable or probable source of knowledge, like observation was supposed to be, or like the holy books were supposed to be. Since there is no such thing, we have to begin with some unjustified knowledge, and we have to have some reason for wanting to improve it, and that reason is called a problem. And in some sense, it always consists of a conflict, either a conflict between two ideas. You know, that oasis seems to be out there, but we know that there's just desert. So how can that be? So there's a conflict between theories, which is a problem, or it might be just the problem might be that we would like to know how to prevent our food from spoiling, so that we are in less danger of going hungry. And so there's a case where some factual theories are conflicting with a moral theory about what we want, or with a desire about what we want. And the only way we can make progress from having these existing theories which are in conflict to having theories which are in less conflict is by guessing, and that's conjecture. So we guess, and most of our guesses, what we do next is we criticize them, and we see whether, for example, whether they look as though they're going to solve the problem, or whether they are a bad explanation. If somebody proposes as a conjecture, we are maybe if we put the food in the dark, maybe it won't spoil. You know, that's sort of, we know now that that's kind of halfway to a solution. But if you have no explanation to go with that, then you can't distinguish it from the explanation. If we put the food in the light, it won't spoil. Or if we cover the food in grass, it won't spoil. Or if we let our animals eat half of it. So there's an infinite number of possible conjectures. What we want is a conjecture that's a purported explanation of that will meet the problem. We now know that the better answer would be put it where it's cool and dry. Very slowly, general theories come out of these conjectures. One of the conjectures that solves a particular problem has generality and turns out to solve a lot of other problems. That's what I call reach. And it sometimes happens, and when it does, we sort of get a leg up so that we can see further than we saw before in the landscape of knowledge. So why does it have to start with problems? There is nothing else.
Well, some people listening might instinctively say, why can't it start with a foundation? Why can't we wind back to something that we are certain to be true? I'm using that word in inverted commas here. Why can't we wind it back, as so many other philosophers have done over the years, wind it back to some first principle, some foundation, and then build up truth from there?
Yes, a sort of bootstrap approach of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps, and it's in a way it's a mistake for the same reason as that is. The foundation for this idea of deducing knowledge from a foundation depends on that foundation being secure and having in it basically all knowledge already implicit in it. And indeed, people did think there were such things in the past. And as I said, holy books, but also traditions. And the trouble is that they were false. All the things that have been used as purported foundations have been proved wrong. Even in pure mathematics, where it was thought that mathematical proof was the ultimate arbiter of whether whether mathematical propositions are true or false, was itself proved wrong in the 20th century by Kurt Gödel. So there are no foundations. There are no possible foundations because of the bootstrap problem. We'd have to justify the ultimate source of justification, and there's no justification for an ultimate source of justification. So that's a problem. And some people have concluded that therefore knowledge is impossible, which again is rather absurd if you consider that it's not a coincidence that you and I are speaking at a distance of several thousand miles. It's because a great deal of knowledge has gone into creating the means for us to do that. So there is knowledge, but we didn't get it from any foundation. Therefore, it must be conjectural. How can that be? Since conjectures are not judged by where they came from. Well, it is because they are judged by whether they solve the problem or not. So we're not looking for theories that are going to be true forever. We're looking for ways of correcting mistakes in our existing theories, if they are problematic.
So let me again drill into that for a second, because again, I'll get you to shoot me down a little bit here, because I can imagine people listening thinking, well, if all we have is this error correction and we can never be certain of or anything, and we can never have a foundation for anything, and if fallibilism is the way forward here, then it may give some sort of succor to the postmodernists who say there is nothing, then there is no truth if we can never be sure anything is true, then what is to say that that truth actually exists out there in the world? How do we know there is an objective truth, even if we can never be sure that we have it?
Yes. Part of this is what postmodernists call truth and therefore conclude doesn't exist, indeed doesn't exist. So this is a token of how radical a change Popper wrought on philosophy. The notion of truth in Popper's philosophy is different from that of postmodernism and of all traditional philosophy, where basically knowledge was defined as justified true beliefs. So the critical attack on that, actually Popper attacks all three of those alleged properties of knowledge, but in particular, the attack on justification, which is not unique to Popper, forces one to conclude that justified true belief doesn't exist. And if you call that truth, then truth doesn't exist. But this isn't what we call truth in everyday life. What we mean by truth in everyday life is that if somebody tells me the shops are going to shut today because of lockdown, then that is a statement that's capable of being true or false. I can go and see whether the shop is open or shut. Not with perfect reliability, of course. A shop may look open yet be shut, or vice versa. And there's no limit to how misled we can be. But nevertheless, it is meaningful to say that the statement that the shop is open is true if and only if the shop is in fact open. This theory of truth is also not original to Popper. It was it's in a way the common sense theory of truth, but it was made systematic by the mathematician Tarski, who Popper recounts that he explained it to him while sitting on a park bench in Vienna. Interestingly, Popper says that he had built his philosophy of science initially without ever referring to truth, because he was afraid that critics would say that there is no such thing, or that you can't coherently talk about that sort of thing. And it was only when Tarski explained his theory of truth as correspondence to the facts, and explained to him that this could be made mathematically rigorous as well, using the idea of meta theories, that Popper, with a sense of relief, rewrote his stuff so as to actually speak about theories being true. Of course, no theory that we can actually utter is going to be exactly true. So the notion of truth in Popper's philosophy has a slightly different role. When he says we are seeking the truth, he means we are seeking to correct errors. But when we correct errors, there are always other errors left that we haven't noticed, and also new errors introduced by our removing the old error. So we're seeking the truth means we're seeking to correct error. But by that very fact, truth is a fundamental sort of regulating principle in the theory of knowledge, according to Popper. Not because we can obtain absolutely true propositions, but because there is a meaning to something being true or false.
So Popper has a very interesting quote, and you touched on it you touched on it in part a few answers ago. And when you said all claims to foundations or all claims to infallibilism proved to be wrong. But Popper had a quote that went a little bit further than that. I've seen you use it. And for many people listening, they would think that doesn't sound quite right when I first hear it, but it does. It sinks in and seems to have a lot of truth to it. So I might get you to explain it. And Popper says it, I believe it's like this. He says, the doctrine that the truth is manifest is the source of all tyranny. So not just infallibilism is wrong, but it's always going to lead to tyranny as well.
Yes. So let me first say that is not an argument against infallibilism. It just because it leads to bad consequences that we don't like doesn't mean it's false. So the actual argument for fallibilism doesn't involve this fact that contradicting it leads to tyranny. However, having knocked down all claims to infallibilism, we can then turn to this other important fact, which is also like everywhere in Popper, that claims to it goes both ways, I suppose. Claims to have an infallible source of truth leads to tyranny, because if you are obviously right, then somebody who contradicts you is obviously wrong, and that is an automatic justification for using force against them if they insist on pursuing this wrong thing. It also goes the other way around. If you want to use force when you fail to persuade somebody, you need to explain, at least to yourself, but in practice to your followers and to those who would otherwise stop you, and perhaps even to your victims, why it should be you imposing your will on them by force rather than vice versa. You might say that in some ideologies, it's the ideology just says that the stronger person has the right, but it's never really like that. That's always just a paraphrase, because it's always in the form, I have this quality, like, belonging to the master race or something, or having the divine right of kings, or whatever, which arguably gives me the right, because if you didn't have that, then such and such a disaster would occur. And so authority about ideas leads inevitably to authority in the political sense, and vice versa.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far, and I apologise for this brief interruption, but I will take this moment to briefly send out a plug for the podcast itself. The Popperian Podcast is something that I've been planning for quite a while, and it's something that I want to keep running month to month. But to do so, it's going to need your help. If you're willing or able or interested, please go to the links below the podcast and support us however you can. It will be your help as listeners that keeps the podcast going and keeps the content coming out, and I thank you in advance. And with that said, we will now return to the second half of the interview. Thanks for listening. So let's step into that political sense then, and to those first two books that you picked up, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And we touched on it a fair bit there, but one of the central things that Popper gets to when he starts to apply his theory of science across to social matters and politics is he looks at this history of philosophy, and he looks at democracy. And he says the big problem throughout the years is that people don't really understand democracy, even though they have it. They think it's about choosing the right leader and how to get the best leader or how to get the best policy. And Popper famously says it's got nothing to do with any of that. So I might get you to take us to the Open Society and that first fundamental question that he begins to open up there.
Yes. As in many of Popper's advances, it starts with the problem, and it changes the question that has traditionally been asked about that problem to a different question. So in regard to science, it changes the question from how do we extract theories from observation, and says instead, no, actually we don't. And the real problem is, how can we improve our existing theories? And in political philosophy, he expresses the traditional view as the who should rule view. That he says all traditional political philosophies have just assumed that the problem is we need to find who should rule and how to ensure that that person or people get to rule and that they are ruling. And he says that is a bad question because every answer, what's his phrase? Something like cries out for authoritarianism. Because if you had an answer to who should rule, which was the right answer, then it would justify you in using force against anyone who challenges the ruler. Here's again the authority in regard to politics creates a spurious authority in regard to knowledge as well. So he says, let's replace that by a better question, which, he kind of says, which should have been the real question all the time, namely, given that the rulers will make mistakes, how can we set things up so that their mistakes can be corrected and the rulers themselves can be replaced without violence? So the problem with in politics being the discipline of how force should be used, basically, how laws should be made and enforced. How do we improve policies and replace rulers without violence? And he says that democracy is the various forms of democracy are jointly the best ways of solving that problem. I would like to phrase that in terms of legitimacy. They are a way of legitimizing obeying the law when you disagree with it. That it has gone through the democratic process is a very powerful way of legitimizing that, because otherwise you have to say that you would prefer that you impose your theories, and therefore democratic systems have to be judged not as ways of implementing the rule of the people, with the people being a sort of imaginary thing that is imagined to rule under democracy, but it is instead the solution of how do we best remove ideas from being policies, and the answer is through various systems of voting.
Now there's
sorry. Go ahead.
There's an interesting side point to this, and I believe I heard you saying it a few years ago, and I believe it comes from Popper. You were saying it around the question when Brexit was still very much being debated in the public square. And I think it does apply a lot today when people have this strange tendency to look at our democracies and lament how messy they all look and how conflicted we all feel and seem, and often have this strange adoration for authoritarian regimes and think perhaps I could be like that because it seems to work with a bit more harmony and a lot less mess and open infighting. And you said this, and of course, I think it's from Popper. He says, of course, if democracy is all about the best error-correcting system, the error-correct bad leaders and bad policies, it is also the case that systems that are good at error correction are going to make more mistakes.
Yes, they're going to make more mistakes, more small mistakes. The authoritarian systems, of course, always collapse eventually because they are less able to solve problems. That's the whole point. And so you can have. By the way, we tend to look at long-lived authoritarian systems, like long-lived monarchies or the Egyptian pharaohs and so on. but most authoritarian systems don't last longer than the dictator, or even shorter than that. The practice of entrenching particular ideas and particular leaders is not itself a source of knowledge. It's going to entrench mistakes. And it's only a matter of time until a problem comes along that the knowledge in that system can't solve, and where the ideas that would solve it don't come into existence because proposing rival ideas has been suppressed in that system. So the mirage is that we see some long-lived authoritarian system, and we imagine that it's going to last forever because it says it will, and we compare it with the messiness and working at cross purposes that happens in democratic systems. And we say, look, here people are working against each other. There in that system, they're all working towards one end. Okay, so the end might be slightly wrong, but at least they're making progress, and then it collapses. I remember that by the way, this reminds me that in the 1980s, early 80s or something, some guy wrote a book called Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984? So it must have been before 1984 this book was written. And I remember how people ridiculed this. The idea that the Soviet Union is going to collapse was, by induction. They had seen it lasting for decades unchanged in its system. The idea that it would collapse was absurd. Science fiction stories, I remember science fiction stories about the distant future, 200 or 300 years ahead, had stories about the Soviet Union and the United States as they will be in the 300 or 400 years' time, as if neither of them was going to change, so this idea that the authoritarian system was unstable seemed ridiculous, but it was perfectly true, and they always are. Even the ones that last for thousands of years, which are the remote exceptions, cannot deal with problems. For example, the Egyptian one was repeatedly overthrown and made very little progress in the thousands of years that it existed for.
So on the other side of this, again, focusing in on a lot of the feeling that some people seem to have about democracy today, and you touched on it a little bit there, this idea of consensus. People have this idea that it's very important to have consensus inside democracy. And of course, part of Popper's philosophy of political systems not just involves not selecting the best leader, but being able to remove bad leaders quickly, but it also has an implication that once we do elect leaders, that they actually get a chance to govern and implement their policy. And that runs against this common notion today that we should all be compromising and there should be a consensus on everything.
Yes. Well, a compromise by definition is something that nobody believes is a good idea, or at least nobody believes it's the best available idea. And so it starts out with that inherent disadvantage. Consensus pleases no one, but there's a worse thing about consensus, which is that it violates Popper's criterion. That is, when consensus policies that nobody advocated are put into effect, then whenever there's a problem, nobody has been proved wrong. in particular, the leaders haven't been proved wrong. What they did was they negotiated a compromise and then enacted a thing they didn't believe in. So it impedes the removal of bad policies and bad leaders, so violates Popper's criterion. Politicians tend to love it because politicians are always trying to evade responsibility for when their ideas go wrong, and they often do because politicians are fallible, like everybody. What a politician would ideally like is a way of staying in power without ever being held responsible when things go wrong. So they're looking for ways of not being responsible. And systems of government that have consensus, like proportional representation, at their heart, also have irresponsibility at their heart. The ability to say, not only does the buck not stop here, but it doesn't stop anywhere, because there was nobody who advocated that in the first place.
So to wind some of Popper to the current moment for a brief interlude here, it is very common these days to hear a lot of people speak in looking at the American system, but also the British system back when Brexit. It seems to run across countries at different moments. It's a fear that democracy is failing in some ways. People say, they speak in terms like democracy is at risk. Our very system is about to force an existential threat to our society and our system. And I follow you on Twitter, and you're one of the calming voices telling people that you're not so worried about this at all. And I believe you see a lot of this as a crisis of hyperbole and not a crisis of democracy. So in this world where people talk about fake news and disinformation campaigns, and people seem to worry about the whole system of democracy breaking down, why are you so calm about this? Why do you think this is not the threat and they're all overreacting a little bit?
Well, so many things. Where do I begin? First of all, there's this hyperbole fad, which where there's sort of competitive hyperbole on all sides, where people accuse each other of being Nazis and fascists and enemies of democracy and enemies of the human race and so on, over issues that even 50 years ago would have been regarded as laughably trivial. At the time of the Great Depression, when millions of people were literally going hungry in the most advanced societies in the world, and where totalitarian ideologies were making inroads and actually getting supporters, ideologies which were literally threatening the end of civilization. And despite all that danger and all that suffering coming at the same time, the institutions were never seriously at risk. That is, the institutions in the Anglosphere, let's say, where the Enlightenment traditions in politics are the strongest. Although there were millions of people who were fascist sympathizers and communist sympathizers and anarchists and people who blew things up and people who staged general strikes and so on, nevertheless, such people did not win elections. There are very, very few adherents of extremist policies won election in say the 1920s and 30s. So that level of assault on institutions of consent it seems to me it is like an order of magnitude greater than anything we see today. And yet people somehow, because of this hyperbole, or perhaps it's the other way around, this is what causes the hyperbole, people, I don't know which way around it is, people seem to like the idea that they are living in a time of momentous challenge, where the stakes are exactly like or analogous to what the stakes were in the Second World War, where it was good against evil, where if evil wins, it's the end of civilization. And therefore, fighting against that is glorious and is worthwhile and gives meaning to life. And so the more you can talk in terms of these hyperboles, the more life seems worthwhile. It's as if making rapid, quiet, peaceful progress, which is what's actually going on all the time now, isn't exciting enough for people when they are in political mode.
Well, let's open up another aspect of that, just from that answer of yours. Of course, another aspect of the open society here is not just democratic systems, but also the society itself. And I might introduce this question with a quote of yours. I believe you gave it in a talk recently when you were talking about AGI, which you spent a fair bit of time focused on recently. And the quote runs like this. I'm going to cut it into two here, but it says, "The knowledge of how to prevent people being dangerous is counterintuitive. It took our species millennia to create it, but now that we do have the knowledge, okay, the only way to prevent people from being dangerous, is to make them free." And that is a wonderful way, when I first heard it, to summarize what Popper was trying to say here. But many people listening will of course think, how is it that you make people free and then that's the way to make them non-dangerous? Is it not the case that if people are free, then they are free to be dangerous, so to speak?
Why are people law-abiding? So the traditional answer was because they're afraid of retribution. That's not true. If that were true, the forces of law and order would be totally overwhelmed, as they are in societies where people do lose respect for the legitimacy of law. In those societies, the political order of things gets overturned. And then, the beggar on horseback is replaced by the beggar on foot, but the lash goes on. The Enlightenment created a radically new kind of society, a society where there is legitimacy that is not based on fear and obedience, but is based on a reason, on identification with the process, a process that one considers fair, one can tolerate when it makes a mistake. So there is a kind of miracle. I think Roger Scruton, of all people, pointed this out, that we don't recognize enough how much of a miracle it is that when a party loses power in a democratic country, and especially in the Anglosphere, they just leave. They leave. Not only do they leave, like the reins of power, the army, control of the police, not only do they leave all that behind, but they would actually fight and die to enable their opponents, who they believe will ruin the country with their economic policies or whatever, to enable them to get into power. Now, this is amazing, and it is counterintuitive if you think of human interaction as being mechanical, as if you omit the element of creativity. So if no new ideas could be created, then the only way that existing ideas could confront each other is ultimately by violence. And the Enlightenment created a different kind of society where creativity is harnessed to create not consensus, but consent. The thing about progress is that in the short run, it involves a lot of confrontation and bickering and disagreement about what should be done next, and a lot of fuss being made. But in the long run, it causes unanimous agreement. So my favorite example being slavery, where a couple of hundred years ago, almost everybody in the world took for granted that slavery was a fact of life. Now, almost everybody in the world thinks that slavery is one of the great abominations. And this change happened through the political process, largely in the Anglosphere. It's true that many societies had regulated or even abolished the slave trade or slavery itself in the past, but this was different. This was not because of an idea that human rights transcend other considerations. It was just sort of in the way that governments often free prisoners as well, criminals, to create some goodwill and whatever. The West, and especially the Anglosphere, adopted a view about slavery that grew out of their view of themselves. They wanted slaves to be freed for the same reason that they wanted themselves to obey the law if laws made by a party different from their own. So they identified with the tradition of criticism in preference to their own particular views. And there's this nice quote from Popper as well. Let's see if I can get this right. Something like...
a rationalist is someone who would rather not get his way because he has failed to convince you than to get his way by force.
Yes, exactly. That sums it up nicely.
So to also sum it up nicely on that talk, I believe this is you that said this, and I'm not sure if you got it from Popper or not, but as you were speaking there, I can imagine some people thinking, but is it always possible to convince people? Perhaps some people are just beyond convincing. And you have a quote that you say, all failure is due to lack of knowledge. So I imagine you have a theory of that if you fail to convince someone for whatever reason, if in fact what you're saying is true, then the failure is yours.
Yeah, well, it might be that they are so irrational that they didn't want to listen to you. You may be right, and but nevertheless, the failure is yours in a bigger sense, because if they are irrational and not listening, their very existence is a problem, which will be solved one day, and people will then realize who was being unreasonable. This again, it happens again and again in the history of our culture.
And let's step towards the future, because some of the really interesting work that you did, that step beyond Popper, was to look towards the future in some ways. And you write that our very survival, the niche that we've carved out for ourselves, is one where you have to create knowledge that's not in your genes. And of course, this comes back to Popper in some ways. The idea, he has this famous quote of, we get to let our ideas die in our place. So I might get to introduce the difference between evolutionary knowledge and explanatory knowledge, and why, when we look towards the future, it is so important that we continue to create explanatory knowledge and continue to make it, to create it as fast as possible.
Yes. Well, first of all, non-explanatory knowledge goes extinct always. So that there are no species today left over from 1 billion years ago. Most species go extinct within a few million years or less. So the particular knowledge in our genes that defines our species will not stay in existence automatically. In fact, what will happen, unless it is saved by other kinds of knowledge, the kind of knowledge in our minds, is that it will necessarily be destroyed. And I think it should be a rather scary and salutary thing to bear in mind that every other species who had this ability to create knowledge in their minds is indeed extinct. Some people think they're made extinct by competition with our species, but whether or not that's true, we don't have a guarantee from the Almighty that we shall survive. Everything points in the other direction except the thing that makes us different from all other existing species. So that's the reason why we have to change. We have to change our way of life so that, and in the course of solving problems that arise. There will always be problems, and if we are to survive the problem, if there isn't going to be a problem that it will destroy us, as happens with other species, then we must create the knowledge to face it. The reason why it has to be fast is, I think this is something you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, that individuals have the power to create very large problems. And the more knowledge there is in society, the more, the smaller the proportion of people who are capable of destroying society. Of course, to some extent, this has always been true. I don't want to exaggerate this too much and become, one of these hyperbole people. Genghis Khan did a very good job of destroying civilizations, and he was just one man. And civilizations have been destroyed before. We don't need nuclear weapons to destroy civilizations. In fact, almost all civilizations that have ever existed have been destroyed, either from the outside with fire and the sword, or from the inside with just decay and failing to have a way of coping with the next drought or famine or disease. So now we have the problem that weapons of mass destruction and so on, again, give the bad guys, the enemies of civilization, the means of destroying civilization, unless the knowledge of how to thwart them is created. And, so long as the civilization are few in number, we have that going for us, but because small numbers of people can create a large amount of harm, that's not enough. So the other thing we have going for us is that the enemies of civilization are mistaken. They believe things that aren't true, and they base their enmity to civilization on trying to entrench these untrue things. And so long as they're doing that, they are impairing, disabling their own ability to solve problems that come up, that inevitably come up, but also the problem they're trying to solve of how to destroy civilization. Civilization's advantage, therefore, is speed. That is, civilization, a good civilization, has the advantage that it can solve problems, including the problem of how to defend itself against evildoers.
So before we get to the last couple of questions here, as you were speaking there, what echoed in my ear was something really interesting I've heard you say. So this rapid need to make progress and the enemies of civilization. Of course, many people out there are worried that the AIs, when they come, or the aliens, will be enemies of civilization. But again, you are not. You're one of the calm voices saying it won't happen. And I imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, that some of this comes from the ideas of Popper, that these people, these aliens or these AIs, just like us, and they will have to create knowledge the same way we have. Let's go there. Why is it that you are not so worried about this looming AI or alien apocalypse?
Well, it's not that I am saying it won't happen any more than I'm saying that humans won't destroy civilization. As I said, there's never any guarantee. It's possible that evildoers will destroy civilization, and it's possible that civilization will make progress too slowly and will be destroyed by some unexpected problem. So that's always possible. But you're right to say that my view is that it's all about the knowledge. All these considerations about destroying or not destroying civilization, defending it, are all about knowledge creation and not about the vehicle that happens to contain the knowledge. It makes no more sense to regard silicon-based intelligence or as being more dangerous then it makes sense to regard people with a certain skin color as being more dangerous. It is only the knowledge or the lack of it which is dangerous. And AGIs, artificial general intelligences, when they are eventually developed, will be developed to be members of a certain culture. Exactly as humans are. And there will be members of good cultures and bad cultures. The ones that are members of bad cultures will be worse at solving problems than the ones that are members of good cultures. And there'll be no difference to what I just outlined just now, that we can hope that the good ones are in the majority, and we can also hope that for structural reasons, the good ones will create knowledge faster. And that applies to AGIs just as much as humans. Now, you might say that the whole problem, though, will be located in the AGIs because they might be faster at thinking than us. But that's not true either, because that is confusing hardware with software. Fast hardware is available to us too. We already use supercomputers to increase the rate at which we solve problems. And AGIs, as it were, just have supercomputers built in, but we can have that too once we have brain add-ons and so on, if that's the way it goes. There are many ways that we can use technology in addition to our built-in technology. And as I've often said, pen and pencil or slide rules are already using add-ons to our brains to make our problem solving faster. We take that for granted. Doing it with computers, we also take for granted. Doing it with AGI type hardware, we will take for granted, once we've had it for 5 minutes.
So as we begin to round this up, I might at first take you back to that moment as when you were a student and you first encountered Popper, and you said it was luck and chance that you bumped into him. Now, I'm wondering as a question of why you think that is the case. I mean, this is one of those questions that when students start philosophy, they say this is of how do we know anything? It seems to be the most important question in philosophy for many people. And after all these centuries of people struggling with the question, Popper seems to have come along and given a very good answer for it. And as I think I quoted him earlier, Popper himself lamented that no one was listening to him very much. And I've heard you have discussions. I'm sure you must have interacted with it at times when people say things like, "Oh, I'm definitely a fallibist, and I believe, and I sorry, not believe, but I understand." Or, yes, there can't be a foundation. I get that. And then their language switches back and they start talking about, well, we must know something for certain. Or if we start from this foundation here. And I'm wondering why you think that or if you think it is the case, that the message of Popper is difficult for some people to internalize when it also seems counterintuitively very simple.
Basically, I don't know. And I don't know even counterfactually what would have happened if Charlie Parkin hadn't told me about Popper. The thing is, I wasn't aware of being interested in philosophy. I was and am a physicist. I'm interested in understanding the natural world. I've got interested in philosophical ideas because it was necessary to understand them to do the kind of physics that I do. The ideas have reach, and that's taken me into other areas as well. And it is a mystery to me why Popper isn't understood as having revolutionized, as having made substantial progress in philosophy. He's systematically misunderstood by professional philosophers, even more than by lay people. I don't know why that is, but it's not unique. In the fabric of reality, I have these 4 strands of all our existing knowledge, where I try and fit all our existing knowledge into these 4 fundamental strands. And it is true of Alan Turing with this idea of universality. People don't get it. Many of the misconceptions about AGI are due to misunderstanding Alan Turing's basic idea of computational universality. And it's the same with the neo-Darwinism, the modern synthesis, that in some sense every educated person pays lip service to Darwinism, and yet they often express this in terms of the survival of the fittest, in terms that shows that they don't actually get it. And then you have people like Wolfson and so on who suddenly turn around and try to explain the history of evolution in terms of species selection and that kind of thing. So it's not an unusual thing for progress at the foundations, which has happened over the past century or so, to be not exactly ignored, because its presence is ignored, but its status as changing how we ought to look at the world has not been taken on board. I don't understand why in any of those cases. The fourth case is Everett's many universe interpretation of quantum theory, which is within physics, where I'm kind of rooted. And there I don't understand it either. I think it's a scandal that the physics community. It seems that there's an equilibrium of 10 to 15% of physicists who work on quantum theory think in terms of the Everett's many universes so-called interpretation. Basically, that just is quantum theory. And the rest just want to use it instrumentally. I don't understand why, but as I said, it's a phenomenon of the 20th century. Perhaps it's because 20th century is the century in which philosophy itself, both professional philosophy and philosophy among where it has corrupted common sense, has taken a nosedive.
So, as a final question from that note there, you met Popper. We must end on this question. You met Karl Popper, of course, many years ago. So I must ask you, how was that meet, and how did it come about, and what happened there?
Well, it was amazing. I have told this story before, as you indicate. I went to meet him with my boss at the time, Bryce DeWitt, who was a physicist and supporter of many universe interpretation. Popper had written some very bad stuff criticizing the many universe interpretation. He just didn't get it from beginning to end. He thought he just completely misplaced what the fuss was about, what the controversy was about. So I had exchanged a couple of letters with Popper, and he had replied very politely. And when Bryce DeWitt came to Oxford on sabbatical, I suggested that we try to, and we were talking about these foundational issues, and I suggested that we try and go and try to speak to Popper and persuade him that he was mistaken. So I wrote to him and then phoned him. We arranged to meet. We drove there in my car, and he lived in High Wycombe, and he met us and talked to us very graciously. I had heard from several people that Popper in person was very unlike what he advocated in regard to ideas, that he was dogmatic, that he got angry when contradicted, and so on. So I sort of was prepared to roll up my sleeves and have a good old fight there, metaphorically. But the very opposite happened. We sat down. We were served a nice tea. I can't remember whether it was by his wife or not, but and he listened extremely attentively to what we were telling him. He asked questions. He asked the right questions. And he said that therefore he was going to have to make some changes in a book that he'd just written, and that he was going to have to change a lot of things. And you know, it seemed to go perfectly. And then we got to talking about something else, other things. The conversation moved on to lots of interesting topics, both in physics and outside. And again, I've told this story before, but I kept having this strange sensation that every time he said something, and I was thinking, oh my God, unbidden, the thought came to me, how weird that this old guy is so accurate and so good at expressing Popperian ideas. And then like an instant later, I thought, oh, yeah, it's Popper. So, and this happened again and again during the conversation. Very strange psychological effect. Anyway, so we were glowing with this, and we drove back to Oxford and so on. And a few months later, this book came out. I forget which one it was, actually. This book that he'd been writing came out, and I eagerly looked at it, and it didn't have any of the things. He simply remained with all his misconceptions. So there you are. I don't know what to make of that, but personally, he was not in the least harsh, off-putting, or dogmatic, or any of those things. He seemed to be exactly as should be according to his philosophy.
And that is also a wonderful note to end the podcast on. Of course, I'm going to link below the podcast. I linked to David's personal website. You can find a link to his two books, The Fabric of Reality and The Beginning of Infinity, but also to other lectures and his ongoing work on things like constructor theories. So I can't recommend people go there enough. You will enjoy it, and it's always fascinating. And David, thanks for the time. You've been so generous and also so interesting, as always. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for the plug.